Okay, good evening.
Good
That was a great one. That made me very happy. Thank you for all coming out. Thank you for being patient with us. Welcome to the third program in the Great Stone Bight Lecture Series 2025. Time does fly. My name is Aaron. As most of you know, I am the library director, and last Friday was my third anniversary working here. So time really does fly.
You do a good job.
So, looking back over the past 3 years, one thing that I'm truly grateful for is this partnership that we have with the Great Stone Bight Education Society, Historical Education Society, to bring these programs to you year after year. Putting together 2 months of weekly programming takes a lot of coordination and cooperation, and it's certainly made my work life a lot easier to have this established partnership coming into it, to bring this quality programming to you every February and March. Also looking back at preparation for tonight's introductions, I found it a bit laughable in light of the frigid weather that we've been having and the predicted snow that 2 years ago I suggested renaming this the Winterish lecture series, since we were having temperatures in the 60s and mid-70s. There's no question that 25 is going to be a true winter lecture series this year. And because I am a librarian, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't promote the library and its offerings. So much like Wilford Brimley used to always repeatedly remind us to check our blood sugar and check it often, I encourage everybody to use their library card and use it often. There's no reason not to. It's much more rewarding than pricking yourself with a pin repeatedly. And doesn't even have to be one of our library cards. We love all libraries, so there's no reason not to use it. But if you don't have a library card, we can set you up with one. It gives you a much better copay than your insurance card ever would. Everything is free. We don't even have overdue fines. If you didn't hear the news, we went fine free last September. So if you have any overdue books, you can bring them back without worrying about having any fines on them. And if the fines were keeping you from coming back, they were all forgiven. Just the overdue fees. If you lost the book, you still have to pay for that. But if you have a book that you've had up for 20 years, you bring it back, no fees. It's very painless, and the only pin involved is the one that, along with your library card, will give you access to our online catalog where you can order books, you can check out digital books, and you can access online databases, get on your computers upstairs, all kinds of good stuff. Okay, the flu is going around. We are down some staff members, so if anybody would like some masks, we can bring them out here, just in case. It's nasty. And then, I wrote this after I printed this out. I didn't say that I'll be promoting Quaker Oats next week after the check and blood sugar. If anybody's a Wilford friendly fan, they'll get it. Okay. Now that I've rallied all the library troops for the cause, I do have a few quick announcements before we get started. So for those of you who are new and need to use the restrooms, if you take the hallway to the left and another left, you'll see a big yellow sign at the door that reads restrooms. You know you've headed in the right direction when you see that sign. Our programs are live streamed, so if you want to revisit tonight's program, or if you've missed any of the past or will miss any in the future, you can always check them out on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and our website. And by the way, we do have a new website, so if you're trying to get to you've got the old one bookmarked, so you'll have to bookmark the new one. It's belairpubliclibrary.org. We have all of our upcoming programs on our calendar of events, so go ahead and check that out. You'll see where our little important story time and crafts and all the upcoming winter lecture series on there. And there are all kinds of things on there that with your library card and pin, you can access online. And then finally, out of respect for our speaker tonight, I do ask, what?
Silence.
Yes. So everybody, please silence your cell phones now. Okay. So when doing introductions to a lecture about the War of 1812, I know it's probably a faux pas to give up the ship, but the Great Stone Bight Historical Education Society is an ally in presenting these programs. So I'm happy to give up the helm to Dan Frizzy representing the Great Stone Bible Society.
Thank you. Anybody a Seinfeld aficionado? Have you seen the one where the book was not returned and it was Jerry's book and George was supposed to return it?
Yeah.
And the cop from the library.
Open.
We didn't have a cop like that, but now that there are no more fines, he's retired, officially retired, even if we did have one. I just want to say a few things about the Marietta Society. As you are aware, we're in the process of acquiring a caboose. And back on the table, there are applications if you'd like to help us contribute to that. There are also our memberships. Anybody who would like to be a member of the Gravestone Marietta Society, you can fill out one of those memberships. We have 4 calendars with us tonight. That's the gift, the free gift that you get, the 2025 calendar. So if you sign up tonight as a member of the Marietta Society, you get the calendar like this, which has a number of very nice photos. We also have a number of pamphlets that I'd like you to look at. These pamphlets are about history that relates primarily to our community. Many of you are probably aware, and some may have attended the dedication ceremony of the Ohio State Historical Marker for the pioneer in Negro baseball, Saul White, who was born here in 1868, grew up and learned how to play baseball here and went on to greatness. So we have the dedication packet that's still available. We also have other PowerPoint presentations that we put together. These are at a discounted price. So if you browse the table there, you may find something that looks like something you'd be interested in, and you can get it at a discounted price. Also, we have rack cards that will tell you about the history of the viaduct, which is the icon and namesake of our organization. We don't want to take any longer because we want to hear Brandon Dowling talk to us about the War of 1812. So at this time, I will turn it back over to Aaron, and I think she's going to introduce them. Thank you for your attention.
And just before I do introduce Brandon tonight, I want to remind everybody that next week's program is a historic district in downtown Bel Air. Betsy Sweeney and John Smith will talk about the historic property survey that is currently being conducted of Bel Air's downtown buildings and what it will mean for Bel Air to be part of the National Register Historic District. Betsy Sweeney is an instructor in the Building Preservation Program at Belmont College, and John Smith will be presenting as a member of the Bel Air Historic District Committee. That's next Wednesday, February 26th at 6 p.m. And if you'd like to help us promote that program around town or elsewhere, there are extra posters on the back table that you can feel free to distribute. Okay, on to tonight's program. Why the West went to war in 1812. We'll answer the question about was the link between the Western states and territories of the war and the War of 1812. Investigating backcountry culture and its influence on shaping the Northwest Territories organization is central to understanding why settlers living in trans-Appalachia adamantly supported war against Great Britain and their Indian allies, according to then Speaker Assistant Professor of History at Marietta College, Brandon Downing. Brandon teaches early American history classes in Native and colonial America, the American Revolutionary War, and public history. His primary interests are Native white interactions in the Ohio Valley, the War of 1812, and the history of Marietta, Ohio. He is currently working on a project titled Performative Violence as Political Discourse, Delaware's during the 7 Years' War, 1755 to 1758, which provides a Native perspective on the Penns Creek and Great Cove massacres in Pennsylvania. Please welcome with us tonight Professor Brandon Downing.
Again, thank you so much for your patience. I appreciate that. I was just in a attempt to be transparent. I had a last unscheduled meeting.
Mike can't hear you.
Am I have to turn this on or? I guess.
Yeah, it might be on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's why that commercial is always so fun. That's what we always say with the microphone. So once again, thanks so much for your patience. I apologize for being late. In an effort to be transparent, I had a unscheduled meeting at the last second, and it went overtime. And I just hoped I could get a speeding ticket on the way over here, so I didn't. I made it, and it didn't delay me any further. I was watching though. I was very on the lookout for cops all over the place. So in any case, before we get started, I kind of learned something new about this area, and that's because I actually have one of my best students at Marietta College is from around this area. And for a while, I've been telling people that I've had a meeting or I've given a paper at Bel Air, Ohio, and she corrected me. It's not Bel Air, it's Bel Air or Blair.
Obviously not from Bel
Yeah, she said she's 30 minutes out, but she comes down here to eat and yeah, I guess there's what, Coleman's or something. She told me I had to go there.
She told you about gulas.
In Goulas, the hot dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I thought my two places for dinner and tomorrow's lunch maybe. So so what is it then? It's not
Bel Air.
It's Bel Air, it's not Blair.
No, it's not Bel Air. It's Bel Air.
So it's like California, like Bel Air.
Or Texas
Or anywhere else that has So you're not different, you're doing the same pronunciation. Okay, well, I'll let her know. And I'll also let her know that, all 20-something people in the audience corrected me. So I'll let her know that. But thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I've never been to Bel Air, at least in Ohio. But I am from Pittsburgh. I'm just north of Pittsburgh, so I am from Western PA, not too far away. I don't know, are you West Virginia fans or Pitt fans? Ohio State, what is it? Come on, you're like right there. That's right there. I'm a huge Steelers fan, Irish fan, except for Penguins, Browns. Even people in Marietta are Steelers fans. Okay. They're the traders. Okay. Gotcha. Okay, Steelers fans on this side and Browns. Okay, so just a few other things here before we get started. I'm pointing at the. We're not functioning on. I have to turn it on. Oh, okay. I teach all the time, I still can't figure this stuff out. I hate when they're going to do something new eventually, then I go learn all over again. Never ends. Okay, so I also have thank yous before we get started. Of course, Bel Air for hosting me tonight, and of course, Grace been glad Historical Society, and Aaron and Daniel for reaching out to me and inviting me and going through that whole process of getting me here. I really appreciate all that. So thank you so much for that. And of course, I speak through the Ohio Humanities Speaker Bureau, which has numerous speakers, and we travel around Ohio and talk about our specialties and our interests and things like that. So we love coming to libraries, we love coming to historical societies, we love doing all that kind of stuff because it's a very different audience than students. Right? Students are usually, I have to tell them to put their phone away on several occasions. But they lose points. You won't lose any points tonight for doing that. So you're safe at least in that regards. And of course, I like these kind of audiences as well because I can already tell you're a very active audience and you probably have lots of questions. I'll be engaged with my students. It's really hard to get them, out of their pajamas in the morning. So thankfully, no one's wearing pajamas. So thanks for all that. This is just the Speakers Bureau, because they're sponsoring me, I just have to kind of make you aware that they exist and I'm part of that. So there you go. Now you know. All right. So I'll refer often down to my notes simply because one thing I love teaching about this time period is the colorful language. There's just the expressions that they use, and just to kind of put us in that time period, and to really get a sense of the era and what's going on, how they feel about things, is much more, vibrant and personal than it is me just summarizing things and just making a kind of a straightforward presentation. So lots of quotes and stuff like that, so I'll refer down to some of this just because, as you'll see, some of the language is pretty fun to get engaged in. And that's the fun thing about working with primary sources. So I'm going to start off with just a little story about the Battle of Frenchtown, which is in Michigan. And it's a battle that not too many people ever hear about, but it's important to set kind of the setting for what we want to discuss today. And by the way, if anyone can answer the question why the West went to the war in 1812, we can just finish that right now. If anyone has no answers to that. Okay, so let's get through this. So the character I'm going to talk about is Captain Nathaniel Hart. He was the leader of the Lexington Infantry Regiment, which was a volunteer unit, so he was militia. And he was part of the campaign to retake Detroit. So Detroit had just been taken, so this is very, very early in the war. And basically the American Army, under new leadership, is going to split into 2 units. So they're going to travel parallel to each other up the Maumee River and try to retake Detroit. But the commander for the western wing doesn't follow directions, and he gets too far away from the main column. But at first, there's 2 battles of Frenchtown, and the Americans win the first one, and then they kind of stick around. They stay unprepared, and then eventually the British and the Indians counterattack, and that's kind of where I'm at with this. So we're in the second battle of Frenchtown, the one where the British and the Indians are counterattacking, which will result in an American loss. So Captain Nathaniel Hart, he's going to survive both battles, but he's heavily wounded in the second one. In fact, I think he gets shot in the ankle, so he can't walk. And so after the battle, he's wounded. He's captured, and he can't be taken captive. The British go back to Detroit, and they take their prisoners with them, but they leave behind about 500 wounded. And those wounded, of course, are too sick, or they can't walk, or they can't make it. And the British basically say, okay, well, you wait here in Frenchtown, and we're going to come back and get you. We're going to bring sleds, right? This is in January, so we're going to bring back sleighs and sleds. We're going to pick you up and bring you back. And so, okay, so they're being tended to, and he's in a cabin of this local resident named John Baptiste Jerome. He's just waiting. Next morning, early in the morning, just after sunrise, slaves don't appear, but Indians do. And they start to kind of walk through the village. Of course, the soldiers are unarmed. They're prisoners. They're captives. And the Indians begin to, they're menacing, and they're kind of getting aggressive. They're starting to take the clothing and the boots and the blankets off of the wounded people, and they're starting to ransack the houses, and they're going down to the basement looking for liquor, right? And so Hart's kind of like, what's going on here? I thought we were supposed to be protected. We're prisoners. The British are supposed to be here to pick us up. So he asked Jerome, who's of course French, and he could speak some Indian languages, and he asked him, what's going on? And he's like, well. He said, Captain Hart, we are all lost. The Indians are coming instead of the sleds promised by the British. Obviously, Hart becomes extremely concerned at this point because he's unprotected, and they know, being from Kentucky, what it's like to be unarmed around Indians, especially in wartime. And so he asked him again, what do the Indians intend to do with us? And he replies, they intend to kill you. And so he can't walk, and so he gets some help by the doctor to get out of the house, to get away from this stuff. And he offers some Indians $100 if they would secretly and quietly sneak him out, get him on a horse, and take him back to Detroit, because that's where the main column was supposed to be, right here, to take Detroit. And they're like, okay, yeah, sure, we'll take the $100. And so they start down the path, and the Indians begin to quarrel about a quarter mile down the road. They begin to quarrel, and Hart's watching this, and I guess they're kind of fighting over whose captive he's going to be, right? Who's going to possess him, whose captive he's going to be. And so they suddenly raise their guns at each other. That the quarrel gets so heated, right, that they face off against each other. And Hart's like, oh my God, what's going on here? He's on top of the horse watching all this, and so tempers kind of go down, and they're like, okay, we don't want to commit any violence. And one of the Indians suddenly raised his rifle again. He pointed at Hart and shot him in the left side of the body, and then he runs up and he has like a war club, and he knocks Hart off of his horse and knocks him to the ground. Another Indian comes up and grabs him by the scalp and gives him the fatal blow. And so they scalp him. They take all of his clothing, of course, keep the money, and they leave him to rot on the side of the road so that their dogs and pigs can tear at his flesh for a fresh meal. In fact, a witness to this, who of course was there while all this was going on, claimed that he saw hogs running around with skulls, arms, legs, and other parts of the human system in their mouths. So the massacre of Frenchtown, which will be the largest number of losses of life in the entire war, will occur at both battles and the massacre that comes after that. So about 397 Americans will be murdered and mutilated, about the 547 that were captured and wounded by the British. So in the aftermath of this, this of course is big news, right? And it's going to be in the press, not just in the West, but all across the country. And it's so devastating, just so graphic, and just so such an atrocity that people don't even know what the battle was. They don't know it's called the Battle of Frenchtown. They only know that it's called the Raisin River Massacre. And that kind of preempts any kind of understanding of what happens here. And it becomes the rallying cry, right? Remember the Alamo? Well, in the War of 1812, it was, remember the River Raisin. And this becomes the rallying cry, right? Especially for Westerners from like Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio, Western Pennsylvania. This becomes a rallying cry. And in fact, what's really interesting is after the United States lost Detroit, particularly like Kentucky, which Kentucky overwhelmingly sends a lot of men off to war in the War of 1812, a lot of volunteers. And recruitment was very high before Detroit, and it just drops off a cliff after that, like no one wants to be a part of it. And then after the River Raisin massacre, recruitment goes way up again. So, that means something. And so we'll take a look at that a little bit later on here. So, nonetheless, this becomes the rallying cry. It's so horrific that Americans are, this overshadows the battle. People don't even talk about the battle, they talk about the atrocities that occur after it. And this is very impactful to Kentucky because many of the men who died or who lost their life in the massacre, these were all well-connected Kentuckians. This was like a lot of their leadership. Like Captain Hart and his family, these were prominent Kentuckians. They had connections with Captain Clay. And so they lost a lot of their leadership with this massacre. And so you can imagine how angry and how motivated Kentuckians were to get a piece of what the Indians were doing. And so this is kind of interesting because this is quite a shift in sentiment, right? Before the War of 1812, before the River Raisin Massacre, most people, and where most of the media was circulating in the East Coast, didn't really care about Kentucky, right? Kentucky was a place where squatters lived, right? People who were similar to natives, right? They were savages living on the frontier. In fact, they called them white Indians. And they really, they denied them kind of this, because this is like the second generation. Many of the Revolutionary War veterans got land grants, especially in Ohio, but some of them moved into Kentucky too. So this is a lot of their second generation who take a lot of pride in their ancestry in the Revolutionary War, and they were largely denied that just because they were living in Kentucky, and Kentucky kind of had this, reputation where people are savages, they're problematic, they're troublesome, and to most people living in the East, they're no different than Indians themselves. And so this focus and this attention and this notoriety that they're getting now and what they're participating in the War of 1812 is a huge turn, right? Because people weren't interested at all before, but now they're very interested in frontiersmen and this white Indian interaction and all this. So we see a major transformation. In fact, if you look at it, how many presidents do we have from the West before Andrew Jackson from the West? Right? Andrew Jackson's the first, and he comes out of this, right? He was a frontiersman. He lived in Tennessee, right? He was one of these backcountry people that was looked down upon. And it's the War of 1812 that transforms that reputation, right? In fact, after the War of 1812, how many presidents do we get right in a row from the West, right? Almost like 4 or 5 right in a row that were all fighting the War of 1812 in the Western theater, right? So we see this big transformation in terms of who the Western is, who is that backcountry person living there, right? And that's the first time really in America's early history where we see this kind of major transformation. So what, right? So the fact that that these Kentuckians, at least up until this point, were not really considered true Americans, right? They were seen more as savages. And the fact that the media and politicians largely dismissed their struggles against Indians. When we think about why the War of 1812 was fought, we have to ask the question, right? Why did the West go to war in 1812? Right? So I want to outline, I think maybe you have some familiarity with the War of 1812. And most of the historiography that exists really points in one direction, right? And this emerges largely out of where I start from is Madison's Declaration of War, right? He goes to Congress and he's going to outline all the reasons why America is going to go to war, okay? And again, love quotes. This is one I didn't want to read, but basically, right, when we look at this, he outlines the various reasons why America is going to go to war. And you're going to see that a lot of these, in fact, this entire presentation he gives to Congress outlining the cause of war, he gives 5 reasons. And 4 of them all have to do with England and what's going on in the world's oceans. Right, so this is the focus. This is like if he had to give an hour lecture, like 55 minutes would have been spent on this. Right, we know that when we look historically, that when we look at the cause of the War of 1812, if you pick up any book on the War of 1812, it's always going to go over these same events. Right, the fact that what's going on in Europe at this time? Yeah, right, good, right, Napoleonic Wars. In America at first has taken great advantage of this, right? Because they're a neutral country, and neutral countries have rights. And that means that they should be able to trade freely, right, with the French or the British. But of course, Napoleon's going to lose his fleet, and he's going to recognize for him to defeat England, he's going to have to shut off that trade between England and the United States, right? So he issues this ridiculous continental system. Right? It's kind of genius, actually, because he has no control of what happens in the Atlantic Ocean. He's lost his fleet at Trafalgar, right? So the British have total command of the Atlantic Ocean. So he knows he can't do anything. Of course, he lost, he'll lose Haiti as well, right? And then he'll lose the Louisiana Purchase. Well, he sells the Louisiana Purchase. So he's lost total control of the Atlantic, but he has total control of the continent. So he issues these orders that is really kind of tricks England because he knows England is going to respond to this. And what he does is he bans all trade coming into either French ports or any ports under French control. Because he also knew that England's biggest trade partner was Europe. So he's trying to, make sure that England doesn't have the revenue to fight these major battles on the continent. But he also knows that England will respond to this, and they do. Right? They come up with what they call the Orders in Council, and this is basically England giving itself the right to inspect any ship that is going to go to the continent. So in other words, you either have to be inspected by a British ship, or you have to go to a British port before you enter the continent. So they're dueling against each other, but there's nothing Napoleon can do about this. There's nothing, he can't stop shipments. He doesn't have a navy, but the British can. And so he knows that, in reaction to this, that the Americans are going to respond to this, right? And what the British begin to do is they begin to stop and board American ships. And the problem with this is that America is a neutral nation. You have no right to do that to a neutral nation. So they're violating American rights on the seas, right? This is a major reason for the War of 1812, right? It's violating the rights of a neutral nation. That's with England, that's on the Atlantic Ocean. The other major component to this is that they begin what was known as impressment. Now, impressment was nothing new. This has been happening ever since people had navies. But for America, who relied very heavily on its merchant marine, right, this was significant because what's really interesting and what you have to remember is that at this time, there were no passports, right? There was no such thing as a passport. And so when the British boarded your ship, and no one wanted to be in the British Navy, it was a death trap, right? So they had to recruit, and recruitment was very hard to get people to go because it's a death trap. You either die from scurvy or die in combat, or you can't swim, right? All kinds of treacherous things out there in the ocean. And because they had a shortage of sailors, they began to impress the Americans into their navy. And the way that they did this, because Americans really had no way to prove they were American, is that the British would simply find out what your name is. If it sounded British, like Downing, that's very British, I'd probably be impressed, right? 10 Downing Street, right? That's where the Prime Minister lives in England. I mean, you can't get more English than that, right? And so I'm American, I have English heritage, and that's what they said. If you have heritage, because the difference here is subject and citizen. There's a difference, right? If you are a British subject, that means you are British forever. Doesn't matter where you go, what you do, what citizenship you gain or lose, you are British forever. You are part of His or Her Majesty's service. And that's what they would say, right? So I'm Downing, I can't prove that I'm not from Britain, but my heritage is English. Once British, always British, right? And whereas if you're a citizen, right, as American citizens, we can give up our citizenship. We have the right, right? You're born an American citizen, but you're allowed to give it up. And then if you want it back, you can come and get it back, right? You've got to apply for it and go through the process, but you can do that. So being a citizen is your choice. Right? You can or don't have to be. But a subject, you can't. You're always a subject. And so that's how they begin to impress. Again, America, England on the Atlantic Ocean, right? All this is pointing towards what's going on in the world's ocean, right? They almost go to war in 1805 with the Chesapeake incident, right? Where the British actually start boarding USS battleships, right? This is like official U.S. Navy, the USS Chesapeake, right? That's a Navy ship. They were impressing U.S. Navy sailors, right? So all of the conflict with Britain is going on over here, right? And that's what the historiography focuses on. You pick up a book on the War of 1812, they're going to talk about that for the first 300 pages, right? So I saved you 300 pages to read, to summarize it all in 10 minutes. So then why did the West go to war? Like, why would you care about impressment if you're a farmer in Kentucky? Why would you care, right, if you have your own problems at home trying to survive, worry about impressment or violation of the world's ocean? Like, would you go to war for that? Right? It has really nothing to do with you. So that's what the questions that began to come up in my mind is, when I was kind of doing research on this, and I wanted to find out, like, what is the main reason? So here you have is Declaration of War, and basically this is what he's talking about. He's talking about impressment, he's talking about violation as a neutral nation, and then in the entire document, there's 2 sentences, just 2. And there they are, talking about Indians. So you've got this large document where he's presenting to Congress, and in that entire document, there's 2 sentences. He's talking about Indian depredations on the frontier. And maybe some British intrigue there as well, right? The British were supplying them. So the British, you could make those connections, right? British on the world's ocean, so therefore you should hate the British because they're supplying the Indians. Westerners are always in conflict with Indians, right? But we're going to see that doesn't really hold up too well, right? That's the story that you're going to hear, but that's not really the story that Westerners will tell you, right? So what it comes down to, looking through all the documents of Congress, right? What's going on from Western representatives, from Southern representatives, from Northeastern representatives, and they're trying to think of like how, right, Madison has declared war, how are we going to strike the British? Well, if you know Thomas Jefferson, the first thing he did when he became president was he basically completely got rid of the Navy. I think the United States has about 4 battleships at the start of the war, 1812. They had no Navy. They had lots of boats, and they're very commercial, but no Navy. And they reduced the size of the army. So they're going to rely on a militia, right? The federal army is very, very small, just a few trained soldiers, and most of them come from the Revolutionary War era. So they're like, old. I'm getting on there too. I mean, living on the frontier, living down in Marietta. We have a big project going down there right now. We have an old elementary school in Harmer, and they're going to tear it down, and they're going to recreate a historical park where Fort Harmer used to stand. And I just think about old General Harmer, poor guy. He was that close to retirement, fought in the Revolutionary War. He's out on the frontier, like, go fight Indians, and then there's a total catastrophe, right? So, and this is like what's going on in the U.S. military, and they're going to go fight a country, the only country that has the possibility of defeating Napoleon's 100,000-man army, right? These are seasoned veterans. They've been fighting Napoleon for a decade, and now you're going to fight Americans who don't even have like 5 officers and militia, right? Have you ever seen what? Do you ever hear what like a militia training is? Show up for militia, you fire the cannon, take 4 or 5 shots at a boot on the post, and then you drink the rest of the day. That was militia training, right? And so you're going to go up against the most professional army in the world. How are you going to do it? Well, you can't fight them on the ocean. Thankfully, they're occupied with Napoleon. Canada. Right? How about Canada? We can strike Canada. It's right there, right? Just right across the water there. And so that's what they tried. So that's why you're going to see a lot of this rhetoric in the government documents, in the negotiations, and even in the newspapers, right? Strike Canada. Let's go to Canada. Let's fight Canada. In fact, right? So that seems like the most obvious choice. And it seems like that's where America would have the greatest advantage, right? Because the British would have to ship their men over. Now, the British do have forces in Canada, and Canada also has a militia. Surprisingly, whether you know this or not, a large part of the militia in Canada were Americans. Canada had a very generous program that allowed Americans to move into Canada for free. But they only had to do 2 things. They paid taxes to Canada, and they had to declare allegiance to Canada. That was the only 2 things you had to do. And so lots of Americans did that. They moved right into Canada. And then the problem was, a few years later, you pledge your allegiance to Canada, you got to go fight Americans, right? So a lot of, not all, but there was a good number of Americans fighting in the Canadian militia because they have to. They pledge allegiance to Canada. So where does this idea of conquest of Canada come from? Well, I've already highlighted this one, right? Is that the great majority of the reasons for war come from the Atlantic Ocean against Britain. Only one, right, refers vaguely, right? And even Madison mentions that. He didn't offer any solution, right? He's offering solutions to these other problems, but he just announces the thing about Indians, but he doesn't offer any way to solve the problem, right? So it's kind of left up in the air, right? And so when you look through the debates, I did, there's a lot of them, but thankfully they're published and transcribed, so they're easy to read. Debates in Congress, right? You're going to see over and over again that they come up with the same reasons as Madison supporting the war, right? Western politicians, even the politicians like Henry Clay, right, and what we know as the war hawks, they're going to support Madison and they're going to support ideas for World War II. And a lot of those you're going to find in the papers and in the dialogue that they also are going to support imprisonment, neutral rights, and free trade. So it looks overwhelmingly like that's what's going on here, right? And then you're going to see a lot of historians right? The secondary sources are gonna say, well, they asked the same question that I did. They asked the question, well, okay, well, we have all this evidence, mounds of evidence, but none of it really answers the question of like, if you were a Western farmer, why would you do this? And so what they said was, I know, we're gonna make connections between national honor, right? You violated American freedom and independence, or sectional bargain, right? So we will cooperate together in a way that benefits both of us. And none of those really work out either, at least from what I see. So the conquest of Canada, the key word here is not invasion of Canada, it's the conquest of Canada. That means you're going to occupy it, as we might be doing here sooner, trying again. Right? I don't know where this is going, but I know the Canadians are pretty angry. I'm watching the hockey games, and they're not very happy. I know that. That's all I know. They're not happy. So I don't know what's going on there. But we've tried a couple times to take Canada. It's never worked out. So I don't know. Maybe we should speak in hockey and just call it even at that point. Hey, isn't that tonight? I think, is it tomorrow? Tomorrow. Okay. Yeah. See, you're watching it too. You know what's going on. You know what's going on. You got there boo in the national anthem, right? So I don't know what's going on there. I had the war of 2025. I don't know. But like none of this really answers the question. Right? I mean, I imagine myself like as a Western farmer, and it just doesn't like I don't see the evidence there. This is kind of lazy. I think you're going to read a lot of, especially order books like this, that are going to make these arguments. So the Warhawks play a big role in this as well, right? Henry Clay particularly. We started with Kentucky. We're going to go with Kentucky. Henry Clay is a Warhawk. He is pro-war. You know, he is of that second generation. He wants to have his Revolutionary War glory, right? They're making these. You can see in the papers and in their speeches, right, you see they're disrespected. They feel disrespected, and so they make a lot of references to this, right? Where we need our respect, our ancestors fought the Revolutionary War. This is all Revolutionary War. In fact, that's why you hear it a lot of times. Like you'll hear people say it's the second Revolutionary War, right? It's not, but people say that because that's the second generation. It's their time to get that glory. Because let's face it, their parents founded a nation. How more glorious can that be? But this is their chance, right, to gain their glory or on some kind of equal level. So Henry Clay, again, love this language, right? War would extinguish the torch that lights up savage warfare and bring peace to the Western territories. The solution is the conquest of Canada. The solution, I am not presumptuous when I call forth the militia of Kentucky are alone competent to place Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet, and the enterprise and valor of your maritime brethren will participate in the spoils of capture. Pretty confident, especially after we found out what happened at Frenchtown, right? Maybe not so much the Kentucky militia, right? But they play a big role in this, and he's very confident in this, and you can see he's kind of making this call, right? They conquer Canada. Right? But there's a lot of evidence against this too. Some of this, I should say too that I get a sense from Madison's writing that he was not too keen on conquering Canada. Invading Canada, yes, right? You need a way to have access to fighting and defeating the British. I mean, after all, he declared war, so obviously it makes sense to invade Canada. But for a means to an end. It wasn't to conquer and occupy. And Secretary of State Monroe, and he agrees in a lot of ways that it's kind of not in their best interest to do this. Not because they had failed before, but James Monroe addressed this issue when he advised that, quote, in case of war, it might be necessary to invade Canada, not as an object of the war, but as a means to bring it to a satisfactory conclusion. That doesn't sound like occupying Canada. Monroe's skeptical in the wisdom of conquering Canada, that he warned total victory in the North would make it, quote, difficult to relinquish territory which had been conquered. And therefore he proposed that in every view that be taken the subject in the most favorable moment for an accommodation of England. So it's not so much that America was looking for complete victory here. It wasn't that they were trying to occupy Canada. It was that they were trying to get what they had asked for. Leave us alone and quit oppressing our people. Right? If you can achieve that without major military losses, then you get what you want. Right? It doesn't have to end in the conquest of Canada, but you got all these fired up Westerners, right? Politicians that are seemingly wanting to do this. Right? And from the Monroe further upon review, even in December of 1812, so just 6 months into the war, right, that the conquest of Canada will become, in the opinion of all enlightened men, a chimerical attempt, and it therefore should be abandoned. Right? For Madison and Monroe, striking Canada was simply a means to an end. It wasn't to actually conquer and possession. For residents, Native Americans living on the borderlands, the old Northwest Territory, right, is a complex story. One full of atrocities, right? We know that there has been many treaties that have gone on here. The Treaty of Grenville, right? It's kind of like the last big one. St. Mary's, I think, comes a little bit later. But in any case, by 1812, Indians are pretty far removed from Kentucky. Right? They're like northern Ohio now, right? But Kentuckians are still going to use them as a kind of foil, if you will, to incite and to recruit and to gain sympathy from Easterners. And so we'll see some of this kind of language here as we go through this. So there's many ways, many directions you can go here, and you have to understand, especially in terms of like academic history, there's never like one answer to anything. And so, there's many variables that you can look at, and there's many ways that you can address this issue. But from what I see from the evidence, from the records that I've gone through, the research I've done, the books that I've read, it seems like to me, these three things kind of boil down. If we're just looking at Westerners and trying to understand who they are, what were their motivations, and why did they engage in the War of 1812, I think that these three topics can address that better than any other topic, right? So we want to examine the literature produced out of the Western borderlands, defining what land meant to both whites and natives, by recognizing why frontiersmen overwhelmingly joined the militia instead of the National Army. We can gain a better grasp of why the War of 1812 was fought in the West. The war was violent and emotional struggle for the land north of the Ohio River, culminating in a final military effort by the Great Lakes Indians for an autonomous and independent homeland. So white backwoodsmen or backcountry people were fighting a simultaneous war, right, to gain access to that same land. And so you can imagine the intensity and the anger and the hate that was between these two groups of people. So looking at this first one, Indian hating rhetoric. So obviously not just the Raisin River massacre, but there's many other massacres going on here, all across what becomes the old Northwest Territory and even in Canada, and committed on both sides, right? By Native Americans, by Westerners, by Canadians, by the British, right? It doesn't look like it because if you looked at the pictures of like soldiers at this time, they're like had this really nice uniforms, they got a really nice big hat, and they look kind of odd because why are you wearing this big hat when you're trying to knock a shot? But nonetheless, they look gentlemanly, they look kind, and they look very professional. But it is a very brutal war, right? It's very brutal, and atrocities are just pick up any Kentucky newspaper from 1813 to 14, 15. That's all it is. In fact, the editor of the Kentucky Gazette, he published his all his articles during this time period. There were 66 articles that he had written, and almost the vast, like 50 of them were about Indian atrocities on the frontier. That's all that was in the paper. In fact, he had a section in his newspaper that was literally labeled like Indian atrocities. I don't think he used the word atrocity, but Indian depredations or something like that. And so there was actually a column dedicated to this, right? So this is like a weekly, so they were getting this information. And of course, this is, newspapers copy each other, so this was all over the East Coast as well. So this idea of Indian hating rhetoric is also not new. It truly starts in earnest after the 7 Years' War in Western Pennsylvania. In particular, it happens during Pontiac's War. And the reason for that is because many frontiers people living in Western Pennsylvania, literally the Paxton boys or the Black boys, right? These things are coming up now because we're getting close to the 250, right? And so you're going to hear more. In fact, I was just invited to go to a conference to do a roundtable on the Black boys. So they're reemerging. And these are the groups, and there's other groups, Augusta boys, I think in Tennessee, right? There are various, along the frontier, various different groups of people that use Indian-hating language, right? In fact, many historians believe that this was the beginning of racism, right? We always had that question of like, what comes first? Mostly, geared towards slavery, right? Was it race or slavery which came first? And but for Native Americans, right? Native Americans are also using this language, right? They're using the word red and white, and Americans are picking up on this and using it as well. So this is really, it gets pretty intense, especially when you think about Pennsylvania and its like history, its colonial history, and then what it becomes in the 7 Years' War and Revolutionary War. That's where all the big atrocities happened in Pennsylvania during the Revolutionary War. And that was a place that was considered, right, pretty feasible. So that language had existed and it just moved west with the frontier. And it comes and goes, right, and it kind of, after the Revolutionary War, because Kentucky and the frontiers were considered backcountry white Indians, kind of disappears, right? But it comes back in the War of 1812. So it's not necessarily new, but it's a very effective tool, right? It's a very effective tool. So the Indian atrocities are going to fill the pages of newspapers in the West and the East, and it's going to show off the sensibilities of frontier families, right? They're constantly in fear of Indian warfare, right? That's kind of what this image represents here, right? Is that, this challenge to these frontiersmen, right? That they always have this fear of being attacked by Indians, whether that's for yourself or your family or children, burning down your property, occurring late at night, and then the barbarities, right? It's like one thing dying or getting shot, it's another thing being scalped alive. That's a fear. I mean, that's a tangible fear. And so, right? So it does really two things. This rhetoric does two things, right? First, it creates the well-worn image of the native, right, standing on top of a white man with a tomahawk, with a war club raised, right, with the scalp pulled, and then, right, the cutting of the scalp. So this is a fear, right? This is every frontiers person is dreaming or nightmaring this every night, right? And then the rhetoric in the papers just brings that to life, not just for them, but it brings it into the house of everyone in America because it's in the newspapers, every newspaper. So it's bringing it, just like the TV in modern day, the newspaper would bring that to life in people's lives. And second, this type of literature is going to challenge that stereotypical understanding of masculinity of men on the frontier, right? So that's not new. When you think of masculinity on the frontier, especially during this time, Andrew Jackson, right? He emerges out of this, right? This frontier masculinity. That's why they go for Jackson, right? And how he fights Indians and what he did in New Orleans, of course, helps him a lot. But he's the first frontiersman to get elected president, and he comes out of this frontier masculinity, right? He's an idol. He's a man of strength for people at this time period, right? Although he did lose his first presidential race, but he feels kind of cheated out of that one. But we can talk about that some other time. Nonetheless, right? The frontiersman was the epitome of masculinity, right? You have kind of this combination of your ancestry coming from England, very civilized, educated, forward-thinking, constitutional monarchy, right? It was considered like the best government, of the time period. So you have that kind of in your ancestry, your background, but yet you still possess the traits of the Indian too, because you've got to fight the Indian, you've got to challenge the Indian, right? You're trying to take their land, so you have kind of this combination. And a lot of people, right, through history have said this is what it was to be an American. Like, what's the difference between an American and a European? Like, Americans came from Europe. The difference is Americans fought Indians, or became like Indians, or tried to take land from Indians, right? That's something that Europe didn't have, right? That's something uniquely different. So all this stuff is kind of wrapped up in this idea of the Indian hating rhetoric and this masculinity, and how Indians are challenging that with scalping and massacres. And they didn't just scalp, right? When they killed you, they would disassemble you, right? Cutting off your arms or gutting you and then displaying you, right? And that's actually part of my new research project, is this performative violence, right? Where they're putting it in positions so that you can see it and you can be afraid of it, and that it's coming for you next, right? It's a warning, and it's brutal, and it's really hard. It's really hard for people to take, but nonetheless, right? So of course you can see that these depredations caused by Indians are going to have frontiersmen declare vengeance on Indians, right? They need to be paid back. And of course, frontiersmen did that too, right? They did the same thing to Indians. So you can see where this kind of plays out, right? So, this is the next page. So when we think about this, then this rhetoric was everywhere in the papers. It's in everyone's houses. It's bringing it live. People are eating this up. This is something, like I said, this is a transformation. This was not something to be aware of or engage in. But now, in the War of 1812, this is all changed. People are paying attention to it. So it has a lot of meaning. Retracing the literature of bloody conflict in the old Northwest Territories, we're looking at Kentucky, Tennessee. I know Tennessee's not in there, neither is Kentucky, but Ohio, right? The massacre that happened in Michigan. All of this going on proves that the demands for the conquest of Canada was an attempt by politicians to camouflage their true intentions, which was to make legitimate the forceful removal of Great Lakes Indians from the Northwest Territory. Right? They had slowly achieved this, but things kind of stalled, right, early in the 19th century. So the quickest way to do that, and what most Westerners wanted, was the removal of Indians out of the Northwest Territory, right? Because Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, they're all in the statehood, right? We're looking at Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. So it's not, right, when we look at Westerners, there's no real talk of invading and conquering Canada, but there's a whole lot of talk about defeating Indians and pushing them out of the Northwest Territory. Seems like that's something they want, because they talk about it a lot, right? And so when you're not talking about Canada, you're talking a lot about defeating Indians, it seems like you should go with the Indians, right? That seems like a motivation, especially whenever you think about stuff like this, right? This Indian rhetoric, anti-Indian rhetoric. So and so we can see, right, that the real motivation here is to remove Indians from land that Indians occupy in the Northwest Territory. And you should also realize, if you want to move to Canada, invade Canada, right, the governor of Canada said, gee, you can come up. Right? We want people to come up, and Canada's a big place to do it. It has a big, plains area too where you can farm. So it wasn't like before the War of 1812, you weren't allowed to have land in Canada. You could, right? So it just seems that the Northwest Territory was far enough, right? That was enough for them to bite off and chew at this point. So that's what a lot of the evidence leads us to. Political leaders, very successful, entrenched the contagious fear that engulfed the borderlands by printing anti-Indian rhetoric in newspapers and other printed sources. And they victimized frontiers and their families, and that was it, right? That's one thing to see this. But whenever, and I didn't put these up because they're pretty graphic, but there's images of, what they did to babies. They bashed babies against trees and against walls and things like this. So, that's emotional, right? You don't want to hear that. You don't want to see that. That's emotional. They're playing on the emotional strings of people who aren't there. And they can't even imagine what this stuff's going on, right? So they're really playing on that sensibility of getting people involved, getting people interested. They use it for recruiting purposes, right? And it works. It works, right? Because this makes people angry. This makes people want to remove Indians from the area, right? Next one down here is meaning of land. Matthew Lyon, he's also from Kentucky, and he was also a war hawk, so he promotes war. He advised the immediate extermination of every Indian who has aided in the attack of our troops, not by killing men and women and children, but by killing or driving every man out of this territory, or by making slaves of women and children, meaning Native people. Right? Lyon believed that this should be official Indian policy, and that it should be never considered cruel to make slaves of the American savage who has been butchering our friends left and right. It should be noted that Lyon truly believed that, quote, most people in this country would advise the killing of every savage, young and old. He also issued a strong warning to the president about how Kentuckians are uncomfortable with the current situation. Indians had been removed from the interior of Kentucky, but the Indians still remained in possession of the land. Right? So they could use this kind of against the Indians, right? Because the Indians still possess the land, even though they no longer live there. So he wants this land. He wants the Kentuckians to have this land. Why send your soldiers, right, to fight frontier Kentuckians, right? Keep them off their land, burn down their cabins, they're squatting. Why are you fighting us? We should be fighting the Indians who are possessing this land. This is what we want, right? Go fight the Indians, don't fight us. And in another letter to the president, people from Michigan Territory, reported that they had a couple meetings, and in those meetings, they wrote a colorfully dramatic letter that voiced their concerns over Indian depredations and how defenseless they were against Indians, by playing into the vivid imagery so prevalent in newspapers and letters, calling the deaths of the young and the old to the savage's tomahawk. Where they did not scalp, they burned to the ground, leaving a productive land of waste. So, again, this goes on and on in terms of the meaning of land, but the fact that land is so important. Land is like the 401k, right? There's not a lot of cash in America at this time. It's still bartering, it's still handmade economy. It's still, people are still bartering whatever you need, trying to you need chickens, and you need a blanket array, you're doing these kind of exchanges, you're doing things on credit. There's not a lot of flow of currency, especially in the West. So land is a representation of wealth. It's a representation of what you're going to pass down to your children, right? And so land has significant value. In fact, I think in America, if I'm not mistaken, and I'll be honest and brag a little bit, I've been in about 40 countries in this world, and as far as I know, America is the only place where you're allowed to shoot and kill someone that comes on your property. You can do this. Ohio has a law, right? Ohio says if you enter someone's property, right, unwelcome, you can shoot them. You can. And because I know I was in Cincinnati, and someone had robbed the store, and the store owner stepped out on the sidewalk and shot the guy in the back, and he never went to jail for it. Right? He was defending his store, he was defending his property. So my point isn't that that's an outrageous law. My point is that that's how important land is to Americans. Right? It's protected in our Constitution. Right? And so that you can't underestimate that, and that's why lots of people came here from everywhere else. Because there was lots of land. Now, it wasn't free. I mean, Indians lived on it, but it was, they felt that they could take it. And that's why they came here. You couldn't get land in Europe. It was all taken. You're not moving to Asia, right? That's a whole different story, right? In Africa, probably not. America, right? That's why they came here, for the land. So you can't underestimate the value and the significance of land plays. And guess where all the next land was? Northwest Territory. As we know, Ohio's got lots of good land, right? So they wanted it, right? They wanted this was their future. This was their 401k. This was the land they were passing down to their children. And the Indians had it, right? The Indians weren't going to give it up, or you had to fight them for it. So this understanding of land, right? Again, we have some other quotes here. Delegation from Tennessee also sent a letter to Madison. Right? The free exercise of those paramount rights which God and nature have given them are the real and true interests of our states and the prosperity and happiness of our fellow citizens, that they should not be denied the land available to them in the Northwest Territory. So there's a consensus here, right? There's no one in America saying that they shouldn't have this land, right? Especially people living on the frontier. They were, after all, the bulwark of the Republic. They were the buffer. They were the buffer from intrigue, from foreign agents. They were the buffer from Indian attack on civilization. They were bearing the brunt, and therefore they felt they deserved that land. Right? And they say so in their petitions to the government over and over and over again. Right? So the protection of land becomes central focus to the war in the Old Northwest Territory. Of course, the people allied themselves with the British, not because they preferred the British, but because they were the only ones willing to supply them to help them defend their sovereignty, to help them defend their land, right? Which becomes contentious and becomes part of the War of 1812. Right? They'd rather be allies to the British than dependents on Americans, right? And then this last one here, the militia. I have no idea what time. In my way over, Michael, on forever and ever. When am I supposed to be done? Like a while ago?
We started 15 minutes late. So
Okay.
yeah, we've got another 10.
We'll use that.
Yeah.
We started 15 minutes late, so we're gonna go a little bit longer. And then I'm done. This military service is kind of like the last thing here, right? So militia service, what is that? Of course, that's a cherished institution in American society for a very long time. Right? That's Second Amendment to the Constitution. So it also plays a very vital role in who we are as people and how we understood things, especially at this time. And I think by tracing whether people had to make choices, if you join militia or you join the federal army. And I think that says a lot about who you are, right? Because are you someone who's willing to defend your neighbors and your family and your friends, or are you here, you're going to do national service, like invade Canada, for example, right? What the government wants to do and occupy Canada. Is that worth it to you? Most people in Kentucky said no, right? Now there are Kentuckians that joined the federal army. It's not like they all said no, but the vast majority, thousands, join the militia. And the most interesting thing is that the militia always, unless forced, refused to enter Canada. Whenever they were fighting the British, recruitment was very low. But guess what happened when they fought Indians? Guess what happened when they went into the Northwest Territory to fight them? Recruitment was, they had to turn people away. That's true. You can look at the numbers. You can literally look at the event. Okay, fall of Detroit, Frenchtown, right? You can see invasion of Canada under William Henry Harrison. Look at the recruitment. Look how it goes. Chart it. It works out. It's pretty amazing. Whether they did it consciously or not, right? They prefer to fight the militia. So they prefer local, right? And of course, those are actually the laws of the militia, right? Eventually, they become under federal control, but primarily you're fighting for your neighbors, right? You're fighting your neighborhood, you're fighting for your state, right? Fighting for your territory. So it's very interesting. If the invasion of Canada was the motivation for Westerners, what would they do? They would join the federal government. Because going to Canada would enable them to look at future land. But they joined the militia that only went to the Northwest Territory, and that was going to become available land. They're switching out, right? George Washington did this, right? This is not like something new. You join the militia to march into Indian land to see what was available. So when the Indians got pushed out, you knew where to go. You knew which land to claim, right? And they did that in the Northwest Territory, but they wouldn't go to Canada to do it. And there's a funny story, because there's a story, I don't know if it's true, but the Kentucky volunteers marched to the border of Canada, and when they reached the border of Canada, their dogs turned around and left. And the militia said, you know what? And they followed the dogs home. They wouldn't cross the border. So, that story true. But Kentuckians like to tell that story, right? So if they like to tell that story, it had to mean something. We can't dismiss it. We don't dismiss, like, it might not be true, but we can't say, it's not how they felt or what they thought, right? So that was very telling to me. In fact, that was like, when I read that, I'm like, okay, that's like, okay, I'm going with this presentation. I'm going to talk about the dogs, because if your dogs are turning around, come on, you're turning around too. No one's going to leave the dog. So I think whether your decision on which side you join, the federal government, the national, the federal army, or you join the militia. I mean, there's more reasons than that, right? I mean, come on, the U.S. Army, bad pay, terrible food. You have to travel the whole way up to Canada. Who wants to do that, right? So there's that, but there's evidence on the other side too. And so I think if you look at the overwhelming numbers, it points to the fact that, local service is one thing, but also we know from history that people are looking for that next opportunity, and that next opportunity was in the Northwest Territory, and that's all the further they would go, right? You can see this time and time again. It happens, right? They will not cross into Canada, right? So, in conclusion, right? Conquest of Canada, guess what? It never happened, right? Or else we wouldn't be dealing with the stuff we're doing tomorrow at the hockey game, right? So it never happened. There was no record, I have found no record, that the federal government planned to invade, conquer, and occupy Canada. There's no record of this, there's no blueprint for it. So you can't just say, hey, let's go conquer Mexico, and I have no plan for it. Like, don't you have a plan for it? That's what you want to do? I would think so. They require that as a teacher, so I imagine they require that in the Army. Right, and then on top of that, maybe this is true because there was no objective to do it in the first place. Right, so there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of evidence saying that that's what they want to do, but when you don't have a plan to invade it, and guess what? Did they build an army big enough to invade it and conquer it? No. Did they build a navy to defend it? No. Right? Did they set up some kind of institutional, right, because there's a lot of Catholics up there, and Protestant Americans, they didn't, So it was like, do you have any, institutions that you're going to set up to govern it? No, nothing. Not one thing I can find that there's a blueprint to conquering and occupying Canada and punishing the British for it. I don't see it. If it exists, I haven't seen it. Right? So none of this was taking place. And in fact, every time that the Americans invade Canada, what do? If they win, they loot everything and burn it down. That's not like you're not trying to, that's not occupying Canada. And of course, we know what happens in Washington, D.C. because the British come and do the same thing. Right? So there's just no evidence of this. And then on top of that, even though it's becoming more frequent now, right, studying Native American history and in the War of 1812, this is mostly focuses on Tecumseh. Now, if you're going to read about War of 1812 in the West, one person Tecumseh, because that's what they always focus on. And he's leading a monolith confederacy that was all wanting to form a Native American homeland, right, an independent country, if you will. But that's not true either. Like, I think at the Battle of Frenchtown, there were more than 12 different types of Indians there from different nations. You can't tell me all 12 of us had the same idea and we're all on board for the same thing, right? So there's great diversity there. You have to dissect that. We have to break that down and see how this plays out. Nonetheless, what we do get, right, is that the use of the conquest of Canada is a neat and tidy package to explain what war in the Western theater was. Instead, two antagonists fought desperately over something they believed to be of extreme importance. And no matter how vicious they confronted each other, they both professed a legitimate claim over the land in the Northwest Territory by justifying the use of force to achieve their objective. Frontiersmen mobilized to fight the war because of their hatred of Indians. Indians, on the other hand, were non-monolithic people, allied to Britain because they saw them as the lesser of two evils. The war ended ominously for Native Americans and forced a removal beyond the Mississippi River. Manifest destiny and the desire to conquer the West would soon involve the Anglo-Saxon nation after the war. Somewhere in between is the story of how white Indian interactions in the Northwest Territory determined this outcome, and nowhere is the conquest of Canada a reason for any other. Thank you. So next semester I'm teaching Native American history. You're welcome to come in and sit on that if you'd like. If you're like good at that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah.
That's it. It'll be about Tuesday, Thursdays.
This was great, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And by the way, I'll take any questions about anything. I like to talk, so talk to you. I'm sorry.
There's no question that Tecumseh was attempting to form this confederation. How widely known was that among the white population, say in Ohio and Kentucky?
Oh yeah, Tecumseh, like if you ask an American, like name 5 Native Americans, Tecumseh is absolutely one of them. So he was well known. He's called the noble savage. Even at that time period, he was very, he dressed well, and even though he was still Native American, he's still a savage. He was still well known. I don't know, like among the entire population, but definitely among government officials and the people that mattered.
They were aware.
Oh yeah, and so were the frontiers people. Yeah, he was enemy number one. So, forming this, him and his brother, right?
That's Kentucky.
Yeah, in Prophetstown, and right, he's the agitator, really. His brother's both the agitator. He's quite the character too. I don't know if you ever read about this guy, the prophet. He was an alcoholic, and he had a vision. Or do you know we all have a vision? Passed out. Yeah, passed out. No. Don't you always have a vision? Well, he had a vision, and lots of people believed him and followed it.
The reason why I asked you that, and I think I mentioned this to you early on when I discussed with you about the murder of Leatherwoods,
Right.
who was a Wyandotte chief that signed the Treaty of Greenville, and it was actually living in Franklin County in 1810. And there was a delegation of Native Americans, Wyandottes, that came to Franklin County and murdered him. Now, at that particular time, there were a lot of, Ohio was by 1810.
Yeah, sure.
So, I think the Native Americans were brazen, and the reason they murdered him was because what they say is that they wanted him to come back and join the Confederation, and he refused to do it.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of those kind of tragic stories. Indians who, you got to be careful because whoever you collaborate with, and who wins and who loses, could depend your outcome, your fate, right? So we have, I was just teaching a couple of days ago about Tommy, who is a Delaware Indian at the Forks. He was like the last one to possess land there. And it's just tragic the things that happen because of who they side with and what the decisions they make. Yeah. And we should also remember that, even though Tecumseh's famous and he formed the Confederacy, that there is no Indian leader. Right? He was putting the coalition together, but that doesn't mean he was like leading all the forces. Right? Indians don't do coercive leadership. So he had to convince you to go. And other Indians might convince you not to go, which is very, very common among Native people. Native people believe in dichotomy, right and wrong, black and white, French and English, right? And they encourage this division among themselves to debate, to have a better outcome, debating like, okay, this is what I support, this is what I support, debate that and have the best outcome. So they see things kind of in this dual ideology. So even though he's on the side of like forming a confederacy, there's going to be an equal number of people probably on the other side. Right? I mean, the Cherokees don't join, the Greeks do, right? So there's other opposing forces there too. It's complicated. Cookies. Sure.
We have a couple drawings, if you'd like to help us, please.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I think my drawing.
Yeah.
No, I can't.
The first one is the door prize. Just pick one number.
Oh, okay. You want me to pick one?
Yeah.
This is quite accurate. I'm just gonna pick this one.
Okay, this is, last three numbers are 564.
What did-
564.
Okay. So they already put the
We have
library.
564. Anybody?
I think that was the guy. Another one? Maybe that was me.
Nobody 564?
564? There's 564
You
there.
got 564?
Cookie.
Okay, there you go. You can see Jim and if you have anything off the table. All right, the next thing is the Harry and David basket. It's the red paint.
That's cookies.
177, Jocelyn, 177.
If you win this, you get to share with me tonight.
Yeah, okay.
Lucky you.
There you go.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You said the election was terrible, but I won something, so it's good after all.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'd be happy. I mean, it's an hour and a half up here. I got all night. I'm not going anywhere. They'd like me a hotel room, so.
Do you know any professors from Rio Grande? Do you know the history professor down there? Can't think of his name. But I had him about 12 years ago. He taught an American Indian history course. He was at Ohio University. Now he's the head of the history department of Rio.
Okay. I'm aware of the college, but I think we've had some students transfer in from there. But I'm not aware of the professor. Maybe if I saw his name, I'd recognize it.
Best course that I ever took.
That's what history will do for you. Good stories. You get someone that's a good storyteller.
Okay. If there's no other questions, let's give our presenter another round of applause.
Thank you.